In the misty hills of ancient Ireland, where stone cottages huddle against the Atlantic wind and ancient oak trees stand sentinel over forgotten graves, there exists a sound that has frozen the blood of generations. It is not the howl of winter storms or the crash of waves against jagged cliffs. It is something far more personal, far more terrifying. It begins as a whisper on the wind, rising slowly into a keening wail that seems to come from the very earth itself. Those who hear it know, with a certainty that chills them to the bone, that death walks among them. This is the cry of the Banshee, Ireland's most feared and misunderstood supernatural being. For over 1,000 years, the Banshee has haunted the Irish imagination, weaving herself into the very fabric of the nation's soul. She is not merely a ghost story told to frighten children. She is a herald of fate, a messenger of the other world, and perhaps, most importantly, she is the last remnant of an ancient tradition that connects the living to the dead in ways that modern minds struggle to comprehend. To the families of old Ireland, her appearance was not a curse but a mark of honor, a sign that their bloodline was ancient enough, noble enough, to warrant the attention of the spirit world. Yet her gift was also her curse, to know of death before it arrives, to carry the weight of terrible knowledge, and to serve as the bridge between two worlds that were never meant to touch. This is her complete story, from her origins as a Celtic goddess of war and death, through her transformation into the keening woman of Irish folklore, to her survival in the modern world as both cultural symbol and living belief. It is a tale of ancient magic, of faith and superstition, of the unbreakable bonds between the living and the dead. But most of all, it is the story of how one supernatural being became the voice of a nation's deepest fears and most profound sorrows. To understand the Banshee, we must first journey back to the mist-shrouded world of ancient Celtic Ireland, a land where the boundary between the physical and spiritual realms was as thin as morning fog. Here, among the hill forts and sacred groves, the earliest seeds of the Banshee legend were planted in soil made rich by blood, ritual, and the deep human need to make sense of death itself. The Celtic peoples who inhabited Ireland from around 500 BCE brought with them a complex pantheon of deities, many of whom governed the fierce realities of war and death. Chief among these was a trio of goddesses known collectively as the Morrigan, Badb, Macha, and Nemain. These were not gentle household spirits, but fearsome battle goddesses who could shift between human and animal form, appearing on battlefields as both beautiful women and ominous ravens. The Morrigan possessed the terrible gift of prophecy, particularly regarding death in battle. Ancient texts describe how they would appear to warriors before great conflicts, sometimes as hags washing bloodied armor in rivers, sometimes as beautiful women offering either victory or doom. Their voices could be heard crying over battlefields, their lamentations serving as both warning and funeral song for those about to die. In the epic tale of the Tain Bo Quailnga, the great war goddess Badb appears to the hero Cuchulainn in multiple forms. Sometimes she comes as a young woman offering love, other times as an old crone blocking his path, and finally as a grey crow perched on his shoulder as he dies, her cries marking the end of Ulster's greatest champion. This image, the supernatural woman whose voice heralds death, would echo through Irish mythology for millennia. But the Morrigan were more than just harbingers of doom. They were also protectors of the land and the people who belonged to it. Their cries over the dying were not mere prophecy, but a form of sacred witnessing, a way of honoring the dead and ensuring their spirits found peace. This dual nature, both terrifying and protective, would become one of the defining characteristics of the Banshee tradition. The ancient Irish believed that certain families, particularly those descended from the old Gaelic nobility, maintained connections to these otherworldly powers. Archaeological evidence suggests that pre-Christian burial sites often included ritual elements designed to honor and appease supernatural guardians associated with specific clans or territories. These guardians, known as tutelary spirits, were believed to watch over their chosen families across generations. As Christianity began to spread across Ireland in the 5th and 6th centuries, the old gods did not simply disappear. Instead, they underwent a remarkable transformation, a process scholars call religious syncretism. The great war goddesses of the Celts gradually evolved into something more personal, more intimate, family spirits who maintained their connection to death and prophecy, but served individual bloodlines rather than entire armies. The word Banshee itself reveals this evolution. It comes from the Irish Bean Cedar, literally meaning woman of the fairy mounds, or woman of the otherworld. The cedar were the ancient burial mounds scattered across the Irish landscape, places where the veil between worlds was believed to be thinnest. In pre-Christian belief, these mounds were the dwelling places of the Tuatha De Danann, the supernatural race who ruled Ireland before the coming of mortals. By connecting the Banshee to the cedar, Irish folklore was explicitly linking her to this ancient otherworld, suggesting that she was not merely a spirit of the dead, but a representative of an entire parallel realm that existed alongside our own. She was, in essence, a diplomat from the land of the gods, carrying messages between the world of the living and the realm of the departed. The transformation from battle goddess to family spirit also involved a crucial shift in the nature of death itself. In the warrior culture of ancient Ireland, death in battle was glorious, a pathway to honor and eternal fame. But as Irish society became more settled and Christianity introduced new concepts of salvation and damnation, death became a more complex, more personal affair. The Banshee evolved to match this change, becoming less a herald of glorious doom and more a mourner for individual loss. This evolution is preserved in the earliest written references to Banshee-like figures in medieval Irish literature. The 12th century text, A Calamna Senora, the Colloquy of the Ancients, describes supernatural women who appear to great families to warn of coming death, their voices carrying the weight of both sorrow and ancient authority. These figures are clearly descended from the Morrigan, but have been domesticated, transformed from goddesses of cosmic significance into spirits with deeply personal connections to mortal families. The medieval Irish scholars who recorded these stories were walking a careful line. As Christian clerics, they could not officially endorse belief in pagan deities, but they also recognized that these beliefs were too deeply rooted in Irish culture to be simply dismissed. By presenting the Banshee as a supernatural being rather than a goddess, they allowed the tradition to survive while avoiding direct theological conflict. This compromise would prove remarkably successful. The Banshee managed to thread the needle between pagan mythology and Christian doctrine, becoming a figure who could exist within a Christian worldview while maintaining her essential otherworldly nature. She was not a demon to be exorcised or a saint to be venerated, but something uniquely Irish, a supernatural being who belonged to the land itself, predating both Christianity and the older gods, while somehow embodying elements of both traditions. The foundation had been laid. The ancient cry of the Morrigan on Celtic battlefields had evolved into something more intimate, but no less powerful. The personal lament of the Banshee for her chosen families. The question now was how this supernatural tradition would adapt to the changing face of Irish society, and how it would spread beyond the boundaries of Ireland to become one of the world's most recognizable supernatural archetypes. As the medieval period dawned over Ireland, the Banshee underwent perhaps her most significant transformation. No longer primarily a battlefield prophet in the tradition of the ancient Morrigan, she became deeply embedded in the intimate fabric of Irish family life, evolving into what would become her most recognizable form. The keening woman who mourns the dead with supernatural knowledge and otherworldly sorrow. This evolution cannot be understood without first examining the unique institution of the Bean Chawant, the professional keening woman who played a crucial role in Irish funeral traditions. In medieval and early modern Ireland, death was not a private affair, but a communal event. that required specific rituals to ensure the proper transition of the soul from this world to the next. The keening woman was central to these rituals, hired by families to lead the Caoine or lament over the deceased. The professional keener was both performer and priest, psychologist and historian. She would arrive at the wake knowing the deceased's genealogy, their accomplishments, their relationships, and their place in the community. Her lament was not simply emotional expression, but a formal recitation that placed the dead person within the context of their family's history, connecting them to ancestors, going back generations, and ensuring their story would be remembered. The professional keener was both performer and priest, psychologist and historian. She would arrive at the wake knowing the deceased's genealogy, their accomplishments, their relationships, and their place in the community. Her lament was not simply emotional expression, but a formal recitation that placed the dead person within the context of their family's history, connecting them to ancestors going back generations and ensuring their story would be remembered. The similarities between the human keening woman and the supernatural banshee were not coincidental. In Irish tradition, the boundary between the natural and supernatural was remarkably fluid, with mortal practices often mirroring otherworldly realities. The belief gradually developed that certain ancient families were so noble, so deeply rooted in Irish soil, that they had attracted their own personal keening women from the otherworld. Banshees who would perform the same, function as their mortal counterparts, but with supernatural knowledge and eternal dedication. The most detailed early account of a banshee encounter appears in the medieval manuscript known as the Lebor na Huidre, Book of the Dun Cow, dating to around 1100 CE. The text describes how members of the O'Brien clan of Munster were visited by a supernatural woman who would appear at their deaths, her voice carrying the sound of wind over water and the cry of the curlew in winter. The account is notable for its matter-of-fact tone, suggesting that such visitations were considered natural, even expected, for families of sufficient antiquity and status. By the 13th and 14th centuries, specific Irish clans had developed detailed traditions about their hereditary banshees. The O'Neills of Ulster spoke of a banshee called Maeve of the Hill, who appeared as a tall woman in grey robes, her hair streaming in an unfelt wind. The McCarthys of Cork claimed their family. Banshee took the form of a young woman of extraordinary beauty who would be seen combing her long golden hair by streams or lakes before, singing her lament. The O'Briens maintained perhaps the most elaborate banshee tradition of all. Their supernatural mourner was said to be Aine, an ancient sovereignty goddess of Munster who had become attached to their bloodline. She would appear in 3 different forms, depending on the significance of the death. As a young maiden for warriors who died in battle, as a matron for clan leaders who died in their prime, and as a crone for patriarchs who died in old age after living full lives. These clan-specific traditions reveal important details about how the banshee concept had evolved by the medieval period. First, she was no longer a generalized death spirit, but a being with specific loyalties and relationships. Second, her appearance and behavior were tailored to the particular family she served, reflecting their history, their values, and their understanding of their place in the world. Third, she served as a guardian of genealogy and tradition, her supernatural nature ensuring that family histories would be preserved even when human memory failed. The banshee's role as genealogical guardian was particularly important in medieval Ireland, where land ownership, political power, and social status all depended on proving one's descent from ancient kings and heroes. A family that could claim a hereditary banshee was, in effect, providing supernatural proof of their noble ancestry. The banshee's presence validated their claims to leadership and legitimized their position in the complex hierarchy of Gaelic society. Medieval Irish law texts, known as the Brehon Laws, indirectly reference this function by discussing the legal implications of supernatural family guardians. While these laws were primarily concerned with property rights and inheritance, they acknowledged that certain families maintained relationships with otherworldly beings that could affect their status and responsibilities within the community. The existence of a hereditary banshee could influence marriage negotiations, territorial disputes, and even succession claims. The banshee's supernatural nature also allowed her to transcend the normal limitations of human knowledge. Unlike mortal keening women who could only lament the deaths they witnessed, the banshee could mourn family members who died far from home, on foreign battlefields, or in distant lands. Her otherworldly connections meant she possessed knowledge that no earthly source could provide, making her both prophet and historian, mourner and messenger. This expanded awareness is beautifully illustrated in the medieval tale of the Banshee of Clan Donald, recorded in Scottish Gaelic tradition but clearly sharing roots with Irish stories. The clan's supernatural mourner appears simultaneously at multiple locations to keen for clansmen who died in different battles across Scotland and Ireland. Her voice heard by survivors who recognize it as confirmation of their kinsman's fate. The story suggests that the Banshee's connection to her family transcends physical distance, and even death itself. The medieval period also saw the development of specific iconography associated with Banshee encounters. She was typically described as wearing either white or grey robes, colours associated with otherworldliness and mourning. Her hair was almost always described as extremely long and either silver white or golden, often depicted as flowing unnaturally in the wind even in still air. Her eyes were said to be red from weeping, and her hands pale and delicate, but strong enough to wring out the bloodied clothing of the soon-to-die. Perhaps most importantly, the medieval sources established the Banshee's voice as her defining characteristic. Her keen was described not simply as loud or mournful, but as possessing an otherworldly quality that could be immediately distinguished from human lamentation. It was said to carry impossible distances, to be heard inside sealed buildings, and to continue even when the Banshee herself was no longer visible. This supernatural voice became the primary way of identifying a true Banshee encounter, the proof that one was dealing with an otherworldly being rather than a mortal woman. The medieval development of Banshee tradition also involved the creation of specific protocols for encounters with these supernatural mourners. Families were taught how to respond when their Banshee appeared, what offerings might be appropriate, and how to interpret her various forms and behaviors. These protocols served both practical and psychological functions, giving people a sense of control over terrifying supernatural encounters, while also preserving detailed observational data about Banshee appearances. By the end of the medieval period, the Banshee had become fully integrated into Irish family and clan structure. She was no longer an external supernatural force, but an intimate part of certain families' identities. A being whose presence both honored their ancestry and marked them as people touched by the other world. This transformation laid the groundwork for the Banshee's survival through the turbulent centuries that lay ahead, as Ireland faced invasion, colonization, and the gradual erosion of its ancient Gaelic traditions. The stage was set for the Banshee to face her greatest challenges and, ultimately, to prove her remarkable staying power as one of Ireland's most enduring supernatural beliefs. As Ireland entered the early modern period, roughly from 1500 to 1800, the Banshee underwent yet another crucial evolution. The medieval clan-based supernatural guardian began to transform into something more democratic and widespread, a folk belief that extended beyond the ancient nobility to encompass anyone of Irish blood. This transformation coincided with massive social upheavals that would challenge every aspect of traditional Irish life, from language and religion to political power and cultural identity. The Tudor and Stuart conquests of Ireland, spanning from the 16th to the 17th centuries, systematically dismantled the Gaelic clan system that had provided the social framework for Banshee beliefs. Ancient families were dispossessed of their lands, their power structures destroyed, and their traditions driven underground. Yet rather than disappearing along with the clan system, the Banshee adapted, becoming more egalitarian in her attention and, more important than ever, as a symbol of Irish cultural continuity. The transformation began with changes in who could claim a hereditary banshee, where medieval tradition had limited these supernatural mourners to the ancient nobility. The O'Neills, O'Briens, McCarthys, and other families who could trace their lineage to legendary kings. The early modern period saw the concept expand to include any family that had maintained its Irish identity through generations of foreign occupation. The Banshee became a mark not just of noble blood, but of authentic Irishness itself. This democratization is clearly visible in the folktales collected during the 17th and 18th centuries. Stories begin to appear of banshees attached to merchant families, to priests, to skilled craftsmen, and even to tenant farmers who had somehow maintained their cultural traditions despite centuries of oppression. The common thread was no longer royal ancestry, but cultural authenticity. Families that had preserved Irish language, customs, and identity were the ones most likely to attract supernatural attention. The expanded reach of Banshee belief served important psychological and cultural functions for a colonized people. In a world where Irish identity was under constant attack, where speaking Irish could result in punishment and practicing Catholic faith could mean death, the Banshee represented something that could not be conquered or controlled by foreign powers. She was proof that Ireland's spiritual essence survived despite political subjugation, that some aspects of Irish identity transcended the reach of earthly authority. This period also saw significant developments in the physical description and behavior patterns associated with Banshee encounters. The early modern Irish imagination, influenced by both Gaelic tradition and Christian symbolism, began to codify specific forms that banshees could take. The most common was the grieving widow, dressed in flowing grey or white robes, her face covered by a veil or shawl, as she wandered through the night seeking her lost family. This wailing widow archetype tapped into deep reservoirs of grief within Irish society. Centuries of warfare, famine, and displacement had created a nation of mourners, of women who had lost husbands, sons, and fathers to violence or emigration. The Banshee, as grieving widow, spoke to this collective trauma, representing not just supernatural prophecy but the lived experience of Irish women who had been forced to keen for their dead across generations of loss. The period from 1600 to 1700 also saw the development of more detailed behavioral patterns for Banshee encounters. Folk tales from this era describe specific locations where banshees were most likely to appear: bridges, crossroads, ancient burial sites, and the ruins of abandoned castles or monasteries. These liminal spaces, places that existed between different states of being, were believed to be where the other world could most easily intersect with our own. The time element became codified as well. Banshees were most commonly reported between midnight and dawn, during the darkest hours when the boundary between day and night was most permeable. Their appearances were often preceded by supernatural phenomena: sudden temperature drops, the unexplained extinguishing of candles or fires, the agitation of animals, or the sound of footsteps where no one could be seen. Perhaps most importantly, this period saw the establishment of the Banshee's characteristic activities beyond simply keening for the dead. Folk tales describe banshees washing bloody clothing in streams or rivers, an image directly descended from the Celtic war goddesses who performed similar actions before battles. The act of washing became a powerful symbol of purification and preparation, suggesting that the banshee was not merely mourning death but helping to prepare souls for their journey to the afterlife. The early modern banshee was also credited with more active forms of protection and guidance. Stories tell of banshees appearing to warn family members of approaching danger, leading lost travelers to safety, or even intervening directly to prevent deaths that were not yet fated to occur. This protective aspect balanced the terror of her death prophecies with the comfort of knowing that someone was watching over the family, even from beyond the grave. The integration of Banshee belief with Christian theology during this period created fascinating syncretistic elements. Some Irish Catholics began to interpret banshees as souls in purgatory, spirits of deceased family members who had been granted permission to return and care for their living relatives. This theological framework allowed banshee belief to coexist with Christian doctrine while maintaining its essential, supernatural character. Other Christian interpretations cast banshees as guardian angels specifically assigned to Irish families, divine messengers whose otherworldly nature allowed them to know of deaths before they occurred. These interpretations were particularly popular among educated Irish Catholics who wanted to maintain their cultural traditions while avoiding conflict with church teaching. The Protestant Reformation's impact on Ireland also influenced banshee tradition in unexpected ways. As the established Church of Ireland attempted to suppress Catholic practices and Gaelic culture, banshee beliefs became a form of cultural resistance. To believe in banshees was to assert that Ireland possessed spiritual realities that English religion could not touch or understand. This politicization of banshee belief is evident in the folk tales of the period, which often contrast Irish spiritual sensitivity with English spiritual blindness. Stories frequently feature English settlers or officials who cannot see or hear banshees that are clearly visible to Irish characters, suggesting that the ability to perceive these supernatural beings was itself a mark of authentic Irish identity. The Great Famine of 1845-1852 would provide the ultimate test of banshee belief's staying power. As over 1 million Irish people died and another 1 million emigrated, the very demographic base that sustained folk traditions was decimated. Yet rather than disappearing, banshee reports actually increased during the famine years, as desperate families clung to any form of spiritual comfort or explanation for the catastrophe surrounding them. Folklore collectors working in post-famine Ireland found that banshee traditions had not only survived, but had been strengthened by the experience of mass death and displacement. The supernatural mourner who had once served individual families now seemed to keen for the entire nation, her voice carrying the grief of a people who had lost not just loved ones, but their entire way of life. This transformation from family, guardian to national symbol would prove crucial for the banshee's survival in the modern world. As Irish people scattered across the globe, they carried their banshee beliefs with them, adapting these traditions to new environments while maintaining their essential connection to Irish identity and heritage. The stage was now set for the banshee's next great transformation from a primarily local and national belief system to a global cultural phenomenon that would transcend its original Irish context while somehow maintaining its authentic spiritual power. The Great Famine of 1845-1852 marked a pivotal moment not just in Irish history, but in the global spread of Irish supernatural beliefs. As coffin ships carried desperate emigrants across the Atlantic, they bore more than just people seeking new lives. They carried an entire spiritual world, complete with its ghosts, its protective spirits, and its supernatural mourners. The banshee was about to embark on her own journey of transformation, adapting to new landscapes and new communities while maintaining her essential role as herald of death and guardian of Irish identity. The Irish diaspora of the 19th century was unlike any previous migration in human history. Between 1845 and 1855, over 1.5 million Irish people left their homeland, most never to return. They settled primarily in the growing cities of America, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, but also spread across Canada, Australia, and other parts of the British Empire. These immigrants brought with them a complex mixture of trauma, hope, and deeply rooted cultural traditions that would prove remarkably resilient in their new environments. Among these traditions, banshee belief occupied a special place. Unlike some aspects of Irish culture that required specific physical locations or community structures to survive, the banshee was inherently portable. She was tied not to particular places, but to particular people, not to Irish soil, but to Irish blood. This portability would prove crucial to her survival and evolution in the New World. The earliest documented banshee encounters in America date to the 1850s, less than a decade after the worst years of the famine. These accounts, preserved in Irish-American newspapers and collected by folklore researchers, reveal how quickly and seamlessly Banshee beliefs adapted to American conditions. The supernatural mourner who had once appeared by Irish streams and in the ruins of ancient castles, now manifested in tenement buildings, factory towns, and the raw frontier settlements of the American West. One of the most detailed early American Banshee accounts comes from Boston in 1863, recorded in the diary of Patrick O'Sullivan, a County Cork immigrant who had established himself as a successful merchant. O'Sullivan describes how his family's Banshee appeared to him in a dream, warning him of his brother's death in the Civil War Battle of Gettysburg. The account is remarkable for its matter-of-fact tone and for the way it seamlessly blends Irish supernatural tradition with American historical events. "She came to me as she had to my father and his father before him," O'Sullivan wrote, "dressed in the grey cloak of mourning, her hair flowing like silver water. But she stood not by the River Lee, as in the old country, but by the Charles River that flows past this city of strangers. Her voice carried across the water, and I knew that Michael had fallen with the Massachusetts regiment, though no earthly word had yet reached us." This account illustrates several crucial aspects of how Banshee belief adapted to American contexts. First, the supernatural mourner maintained her traditional appearance and behavior while adapting to new geographical settings. Second, she continued to provide information that could not be obtained through normal channels, demonstrating that her otherworldly knowledge transcended physical distance. Third, she served as a link between the immigrant family and their traditional Irish identity, even in the midst of participating in distinctly American events like the Civil War. The urban environment of Irish-American communities created new contexts for Banshee encounters that had no precedent in rural Irish tradition. Stories began to circulate of Banshees appearing in tenement hallways, their keening echoing through crowded buildings where dozens of families lived in close proximity. These urban Banshees had to compete with the noise and chaos of industrial cities, leading to reports of supernatural mourners whose voices could somehow cut through the din of factory whistles and street traffic to reach their intended audience. The mining communities of Pennsylvania, Colorado, and Montana provided another new context for Banshee appearances. Irish miners, working in conditions that combined the dangers of industrial labor with the isolation of frontier life, reported Banshee encounters that reflected their unique circumstances. These supernatural mourners were said to appear at mine entrances, their keening warning of cave-ins, explosions, or other disasters that claimed Irish lives far from home. The American frontier presented perhaps the greatest challenge to traditional Banshee belief. In the vast spaces of the American West, where Irish immigrants worked as railroad builders, cattle ranchers, and frontier soldiers, the intimate scale of traditional Irish community life was impossible to maintain. Yet even here, Banshee traditions adapted and survived. Cowboys of Irish descent reported hearing supernatural keening across the prairie wind, and railroad workers spoke of ghostly women in grey who appeared along the tracks to mourn their countrymen who died building. America's transportation network, the Civil War period, proved to be a crucial test of Banshee belief's adaptability. Irish Americans served in large numbers on both sides of the conflict, and many families found themselves scattered across a continent convulsed by warfare. Traditional methods of receiving news about distant family members were completely inadequate to the scale and chaos of modern warfare. In this context, Banshee encounters provided both comfort and information, offering families a supernatural communication network that transcended the limitations of earthly postal systems. The war also created new forms of Banshee manifestation that reflected the industrial scale of modern conflict. Stories circulated of Banshees appearing on Civil War battlefields, their voices joining the chorus of the dying as they keened for Irish soldiers from both armies. These battlefield Banshees were described as taking on aspects of the American environment, dressed in grey like Confederate soldiers or blue like Union troops, but still maintaining their traditional long hair and otherworldly appearance. The post-Civil War period saw the institutionalization of Irish American Banshee belief through the establishment of Irish cultural organizations, newspapers, and social clubs. These institutions provided forums for sharing Banshee encounters and maintaining the oral traditions that kept these beliefs alive. The ancient order of Hibernians, founded in 1836 but growing rapidly after the Civil War, became a particularly important venue for preserving and transmitting supernatural traditions among Irish American men. Irish American women's organizations played an equally crucial role in maintaining Banshee traditions. Groups like the Ladies' Auxiliary of the Ancient Order of Hibernians and various Catholic sodalities provided spaces where older women could pass down traditional knowledge about supernatural encounters to younger generations. These organizations recognized that Banshee belief was an important part of Irish cultural identity that needed to be preserved even as families became increasingly assimilated into American society. Late 19th century also saw the first systematic attempts to collect and document Irish American supernatural traditions. Folklore researchers like Jeremiah Curtin and Lady Augusta Gregory traveled through Irish American communities, recording Banshee encounters and other supernatural beliefs. Their work revealed the remarkable consistency of these traditions across different American regions and the creative ways that Irish immigrants had adapted their supernatural beliefs to American conditions. These collection efforts also documented the emergence of distinctly Irish American variations on traditional Banshee themes. For example, stories began to appear of Banshees who could predict not just death, but other forms of loss, the failure of businesses, the breakup of families, or the abandonment of Irish cultural traditions. These expanded prophetic powers reflected the broader anxieties of immigrant communities struggling to maintain their identity while adapting to American life. The railroad era brought another significant development in American Banshee tradition, the emergence of traveling Banshees who followed Irish families. As they moved across the continent, these supernatural mourners were said to adapt their appearances to local conditions, appearing as frontier women in the West, as factory workers' wives in industrial cities, or as farm women in rural areas, but always maintaining their essential otherworldly nature and their connection to specific Irish families. The phenomenon of traveling Banshees reflected a crucial adaptation to American mobility. Unlike Ireland, where families might live in the same area for centuries, America was a nation of constant movement. Irish immigrants followed jobs, opportunities, and family connections across vast distances. The Banshee's ability to maintain her connection to families regardless of location became a powerful symbol of cultural continuity in a world of constant change. By 1900, Banshee belief had become thoroughly integrated into Irish American culture while maintaining its essential supernatural character. The supernatural mourner who had once appeared by Irish streams and in ancient graveyards now manifested in American cities and on American frontiers, but her fundamental nature as herald of death, guardian of family, and symbol of Irish identity remained unchanged. This successful adaptation laid the groundwork for the Banshee's next great transformation. Her emergence from ethnic folklore into global popular culture, where she would take on new meanings and reach new audiences while somehow maintaining her connection to her Irish roots. As the 20th century dawned, the Banshee stood at a crossroads. She had successfully adapted from ancient Celtic goddess to medieval clan guardian to immigrant folk belief, maintaining her essential nature while transforming to meet the needs of each new era. But now she faced perhaps her greatest challenge and opportunity, the emergence of global mass media that would expose her to audiences far beyond the Irish diaspora while simultaneously threatening to strip away the cultural context that gave her meaning. The transformation began with the Celtic Revival movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Writers like W.B. Yeats, Lady Augusta Gregory, and J.M. Synge, seeking to create a distinctly Irish literary tradition, turned to folklore and mythology for inspiration. The Banshee, with her combination of supernatural power and deep cultural significance, proved irresistible to these literary pioneers, who were attempting to define Irish identity in opposition to British cultural domination. Yeats, in particular, played a crucial role in introducing the Banshee to international literary audiences. His 1888 collection, Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry, included several Banshee accounts that he had collected from rural Irish sources. But Yeats was not merely preserving folklore, he was consciously crafting it for consumption by educated, cosmopolitan readers who might have little direct knowledge of Irish rural traditions. In Yeats's literary treatment, the Banshee became a romantic figure, less terrifying herald of death than melancholy symbol of Irish spiritual sensitivity. This romanticization would prove to be both blessing and curse for the Banshee's global reception. On one hand, it made her accessible to international audiences, who might otherwise dismiss her as primitive superstition. On the other hand, it began a process of sanitization that would eventually distance her from her authentic cultural roots. The Celtic revival's influence extended far beyond literature into theatre, visual arts, and eventually film. Early 20th century productions like Yeats and Gregory's Kathleen Ní Houlihan used banshee-like figures as symbols of Irish nationalism, supernatural women whose keening represented the sorrow of a colonized nation. These theatrical interpretations established precedents for using the banshee as a political and cultural symbol rather than simply a supernatural belief. The emergence of Hollywood in the 1920s and 1930s created unprecedented opportunities for Irish supernatural traditions to reach global audiences. Early horror films, seeking exotic and frightening subject matter, quickly discovered the cinematic potential of the Wailing Banshee. The 1935 film The Banshee, directed by Lambert Hillier, was one of the first to bring the Irish supernatural mourner to American movie screens, though it relocated the action to Scotland and significantly altered the traditional characteristics of Banshee encounters. This early cinematic treatment established patterns that would influence Banshee portrayals for decades to come. Hollywood's Banshee was typically more visually dramatic than her folklore counterpart, glowing with supernatural light, floating rather than walking, and possessing obviously magical powers that went far beyond traditional death prophecy. These cinematic enhancements made for compelling visual entertainment, but began the process of transforming the Banshee from a culturally specific supernatural belief into a generic horror movie monster. The 1940s and 1950s saw the Banshee appear in numerous B-grade horror films, radio dramas, and pulp fiction stories. These popular culture representations typically stripped away most cultural context, presenting the Banshee simply as a supernatural threat that could be transplanted to any setting. The intimate relationship between Banshee and family, so crucial to authentic Irish tradition, was often replaced by more generic horror tropes. The Banshee as revenge-seeking ghost, as harbinger of general doom, or as supernatural serial killer. Walt Disney's 1959 film Darby O'Gill and the Little People represented both the pinnacle and the nadir of mid-20th century Banshee representation. The film's Banshee sequence, featuring a terrifying supernatural mourner who comes to claim the souls of the dying, was remarkably faithful to traditional Irish descriptions of Banshee encounters. The Banshee appeared as a tall, pale woman in flowing robes, her voice carrying otherworldly power, and her connection to specific individuals rather than random victims. Yet Disney's Banshee also embodied the limitations of popular culture representation. Embedded within a family-friendly fantasy film, she became just another colorful element in a romanticized vision of Irish culture that had little connection to the lived experience of actual Irish people. The film's Banshee was authentically frightening but culturally inauthentic, a supernatural tourist attraction rather than a genuine folk belief. The 1960s and 1970s brought new challenges to Banshee tradition, as Ireland itself underwent rapid modernization. Television, improved education, and urban migration were eroding the rural communities that had maintained supernatural traditions for centuries. Young Irish people, educated in modern schools and exposed to global media, were increasingly skeptical of the folk beliefs that had sustained their grandparents. Paradoxically, this same period saw growing international interest in Irish culture, driven partly by the global success of Irish traditional music and partly by the romanticization of Celtic spirituality that would reach full flower in the New Age movement of the 1980s and 1990s. The Banshee, as one of the most recognizable figures in Irish supernatural tradition, benefited from this increased interest even as her authentic cultural context was being eroded. The horror film renaissance of the 1970s and 1980s brought renewed cinematic attention to the Banshee, but typically in forms that bore little resemblance to traditional Irish belief. Films like The Banshee Chapter, 2013, and various episodes of supernatural television series used the Banshee name and basic concept, but transplanted them into entirely non-Irish contexts, treating her as just another supernatural monster that could threaten anyone, anywhere. More faithful representations appeared in specifically Irish productions like The Crying Game, 1992, and various works by Irish filmmakers who understood the cultural significance of Banshee tradition. These films typically used Banshee imagery metaphorically as symbols of Irish trauma, loss, and the persistence of traditional identity in a modernizing world. The rise of the internet in the 1990s and 2000s created new opportunities for both authentic and inauthentic Banshee representation. Online forums devoted to supernatural encounters included numerous accounts of Banshee experiences from people of Irish descent around the world, suggesting that the tradition maintains some vitality even in digital age. At the same time, internet horror fiction and viral videos frequently featured banshees that bore no resemblance to traditional Irish beliefs, treating her as a generic supernatural threat. Young adult literature of the 2000s and 2010s discovered the Banshee as a rich source of supernatural romance material. Series like Patricia Briggs's Mercedes Thompson novels and Rachel Vincent's Soul Screamers series featured Banshee characters as protagonists, typically young women struggling to understand and control their supernatural abilities. These literary banshees maintained some connection to traditional death prophecy, but were primarily vehicles for exploring themes of identity, power, and belonging that resonated with teenage readers. The Marvel Comics universe introduced perhaps the most widely recognized modern Banshee character in the form of Sean Cassidy, a mutant superhero whose sonic scream powers were explicitly connected to his Irish heritage and traditional Banshee mythology. This character, appearing in X-Men comics since 1975 and various film adaptations, represents both the globalization of Banshee imagery and its increasing disconnection from authentic cultural context. Contemporary horror media continues to mine Banshee tradition for supernatural material with varying degrees of cultural sensitivity and authenticity. Films like The Banshees of Inisherin, 2022, use Banshee imagery metaphorically to explore themes of friendship, tradition, and cultural change in modern Ireland, while generic horror productions continue to treat the Banshee as interchangeable with other supernatural threats. The challenge facing Banshee tradition in the digital age is maintaining authentic cultural connection while adapting to global media consumption. Social media platforms like TikTok and YouTube feature numerous videos about Banshee encounters and traditions, created by both cultural preservationists seeking to educate audiences about authentic Irish folklore and content creators seeking to capitalize on supernatural interest regardless of cultural accuracy. The tension between authenticity and accessibility remains unresolved. Popular culture representations have undoubtedly introduced the Banshee to audiences who would otherwise never encounter Irish supernatural tradition, potentially sparking genuine interest in Irish culture and history. But these same representations have also contributed to the dilution and misunderstanding of traditions that once served crucial psychological and cultural functions for Irish communities. As we move deeper into the 21st century, the Banshee faces the same challenges confronting all traditional cultures in a globalized world. How to maintain authentic identity while remaining relevant to new generations. How to preserve essential meaning while adapting to new media and contexts. And how to distinguish between cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation in an interconnected world where boundaries between communities are increasingly fluid. The Banshee's journey from ancient goddess to global pop culture icon reflects broader patterns of cultural transmission and transformation in the modern world. Her story illuminates both the remarkable resilience of human storytelling traditions and the complex challenges facing traditional cultures in an age of global media and rapid social change. In the early hours of March 15, 2019, Margaret O'Brien sat vigil beside her dying father in a hospital room in Cork City. As the machines monitoring his vital signs began their ominous slowing, she heard something that made her blood freeze, a low, keening wail that seemed to come from the walls themselves, growing louder and more mournful until it filled the entire room. The nurses heard nothing. The other family members present showed no sign of awareness, but Margaret, descended from generations of Cork O'Briens, knew exactly what she was hearing. Her family's Banshee had come to keen for the dying patriarch, maintaining a supernatural tradition that had supposedly died out with the old Ireland of stone cottages and turf fires. Margaret's experience is far from unique in 21st century Ireland. Despite predictions that modernization, urbanization, and scientific education would eliminate supernatural beliefs, encounters with banshees continue to be reported across Ireland and throughout the global Irish diaspora. These modern encounters reveal both the remarkable persistence of traditional beliefs in their continued evolution in response to contemporary conditions. The survival of banshee belief in modern Ireland is particularly striking given the country's rapid transformation over the past 50 years. The Ireland of 2024 bears little resemblance to the rural agricultural society that sustained traditional folklore for centuries. Over 80% of the population now lives in urban areas. Higher education is nearly universal, and the country has become one of Europe's most technologically advanced economies. Yet folklore collectors and paranormal researchers continue to document banshee encounters with surprising frequency. Dr. Jenny Butler of University College Cork, who has studied contemporary Irish supernatural beliefs for over 2 decades, notes that banshee reports have not diminished as expected, but have instead adapted to modern circumstances. We're seeing banshees appearing in hospital corridors, nursing homes, and even urban apartments, she explains. The fundamental belief structure remains intact, but the contexts have evolved to match contemporary Irish life. This adaptation is visible in the changing patterns of modern banshee encounters. Where traditional reports typically featured banshees appearing outdoors, by streams, at crossroads, or in ancient graveyards, contemporary accounts are increasingly likely to feature indoor manifestations. Banshees are reported in hospital waiting rooms, nursing home hallways, and private homes. Their supernatural nature adapted to the reality that most modern deaths occur in institutional rather than domestic settings. The democratization of banshee belief, which began in the early modern period, has continued and accelerated in contemporary Ireland. While traditional accounts typically restricted banshee attention to ancient Gaelic families, modern reports come from people of all social backgrounds, and even from those with mixed Irish heritage. The criterion seems to have shifted from noble ancestry to cultural connection. People who identify strongly with Irish heritage, regardless of their precise genealogical credentials, are the most likely to report banshee encounters. This expansion is particularly evident in the Irish diaspora, where 3rd and 4th generation Irish Americans, Irish Australians, and Irish Canadians continue to report banshee encounters, despite having been born and raised far from Ireland. These reports suggest that banshee belief functions as much as a marker of cultural identity as a supernatural phenomenon, providing individuals with a tangible connection to their Irish heritage. The internet age has created new platforms for sharing and validating Banshee experiences. Online forums devoted to Irish culture and supernatural encounters feature hundreds of detailed accounts from people around the world describing Banshee encounters. These digital narratives maintain many traditional elements: the distinctive keening voice, the appearance of a woman in white or grey, the connection to family deaths, while adapting to contemporary contexts and communication styles. Social media platforms like Facebook and Reddit host active communities where people share Banshee experiences and seek interpretation from others familiar with Irish supernatural traditions. These online communities serve functions similar to traditional Irish wake gatherings, providing spaces where supernatural experiences can be shared, validated, and integrated into family and community narratives. YouTube has become a particularly important platform for Banshee-related content, featuring everything from scholarly discussions of Irish folklore to dramatic reenactments of supposed encounters. Some of these videos represent genuine attempts at cultural preservation, created by Irish cultural organizations or folklore enthusiasts, seeking to educate audiences about authentic traditions. Others are purely entertainment-focused, using Banshee imagery for horror content with little connection to traditional Irish beliefs. The persistence of Banshee belief in modern Ireland has attracted the attention of psychologists and anthropologists, seeking to understand why certain supernatural traditions survive while others disappear. Dr. Michael O'Sullivan of Trinity College, Dublin has studied contemporary Banshee reports as part of his research into paranormal beliefs in modern societies. His findings suggest that Banshee encounters serve important psychological functions even in contemporary contexts. The Banshee provides a framework for processing grief and loss that many people find more satisfying than purely medical or secular approaches, O'Sullivan explains. She offers the possibility that death is not simply biological termination but part of a larger spiritual reality in which family connections transcend mortality. This psychological function may explain why Banshee reports often cluster around periods of social stress or rapid change. Research suggests that encounters increase during economic downturns, health crises, and periods of cultural uncertainty, when people are seeking sources of meaning and connection that transcend immediate material circumstances. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020-22 provided an unexpected test case for the relevance of traditional supernatural beliefs in modern crisis situations, as Ireland, like much of the world, experienced widespread illness, death, and social isolation. Folklore researchers documented a significant increase in reports of supernatural encounters, including Banshee sightings. These pandemic-era reports often featured Banshees adapting to public health restrictions, appearing outside hospital windows rather than inside wards, or manifesting in video calls to families unable to gather in person for traditional wakes. Contemporary Banshee encounters also reflect changing Irish attitudes toward death and dying. In traditional Irish society, death was a communal experience involving extended family networks and elaborate ritual practices. Modern Irish society, influenced by medical professionalization and urban individualism, has largely moved death behind institutional walls and reduced public mourning rituals. In this context, Banshee encounters may represent an unconscious attempt to restore spiritual and communal dimensions to experiences that have become increasingly medicalized and privatized. The gendered aspects of Banshee tradition have also evolved in response to changing Irish society. While traditional Banshee beliefs were primarily maintained and transmitted by women, who served as the keening women and funeral organizers in Irish communities, contemporary reports come equally from men and women. This shift reflects both changing gender roles in Irish society and the individualization of supernatural experience in modern contexts. Young Irish people, despite growing up in an increasingly secular and scientific culture, continue to report Banshee encounters at surprising rates. A 2019 survey conducted by the Irish Folklore Commission found that nearly 30% of Irish adults under age 35 claim to have had some form of supernatural experience, with Banshee encounters representing a significant portion of these reports. This suggests that supernatural beliefs retain relevance even for generations raised in post-traditional Ireland. The tourism industry has inevitably discovered the commercial potential of Banshee tradition, with ghost tours, supernatural museums, and heritage sites throughout Ireland, featuring Banshee-related attractions. While these commercial applications often simplify or sensationalize authentic traditions, they also serve to maintain public awareness of Irish supernatural beliefs and can sometimes spark genuine interest in cultural preservation. Irish cultural organizations both in Ireland and throughout the diaspora have recognized the importance of Banshee tradition as a marker of authentic Irish identity. Groups like Comhaltas Síoltóirí Éireann and the Irish Cultural Centre in various cities now include discussions of supernatural traditions in their cultural education programs, presenting Banshee beliefs alongside music, dance, and language as essential components of Irish heritage. Academic institutions have also begun to take Banshee tradition more seriously as a subject of scholarly investigation. Universities in Ireland, the United States, and other countries now offer courses in Irish folklore that treat supernatural beliefs not as primitive superstitions to be debunked, but as complex cultural phenomena worthy of serious analysis. This academic legitimation has helped ensure that Banshee traditions are preserved and studied even as their original cultural contexts continue to evolve. The medical community in Ireland has developed a surprisingly nuanced approach to patients who report supernatural experiences, including Banshee encounters, while maintaining scientific skepticism about the objective reality of such experiences. Many healthcare professionals recognize their psychological and cultural significance for patients. Some hospitals and nursing homes in areas with strong Irish traditional culture have developed informal protocols for respecting patients' supernatural beliefs while providing appropriate medical care. Contemporary Banshee belief also reflects the broader revival of interest in Celtic spirituality that has characterized the past several decades. Neo-pagan movements, New Age spirituality, and Celtic Reconstructionist religions have all drawn on Banshee imagery and traditions, though often adapting them to fit contemporary spiritual frameworks that may have little connection to traditional Irish Catholicism or pre-Christian Celtic religion. These spiritual appropriations of Banshee tradition raise complex questions about cultural authenticity and ownership. While some Irish cultural preservationists welcome any interest that helps maintain awareness of traditional beliefs, others worry that decontextualized spiritual practices strip Banshee tradition of its specific cultural meaning and reduce it to generic supernatural material. The question of cultural appropriation becomes particularly complex in the context of global spiritual movements that draw on multiple traditions without deep understanding of their original contexts. Celtic spirituality workshops in California, neo-pagan rituals in Germany, and New Age healing practices in Australia all sometimes incorporate Banshee imagery and concepts, but in ways that may bear little resemblance to authentic Irish beliefs. As we move further into the 21st century, Banshee tradition faces both opportunities and challenges. Increased global interest in cultural diversity and indigenous knowledge systems has created new audiences for authentic Irish supernatural traditions, while digital technologies offer unprecedented opportunities for preserving and transmitting traditional knowledge. At the same time, globalization and cultural homogenization threaten to reduce distinctive cultural traditions to generic spiritual products divorced from their original contexts. The Banshees' survival through more than a millennium of cultural change suggests remarkable resilience, but also raises questions about what aspects of tradition are essential and what can be adapted without losing fundamental meaning. As Irish communities continue to evolve and disperse globally, the challenge will be maintaining the authentic cultural connections that give Banshee tradition its power, while allowing enough adaptation to remain relevant to new generations and new contexts. The eternal keen continues, but its form and meaning continue to evolve, reflecting both the persistence of human spiritual needs and the endless creativity of cultural adaptation. Whether future generations will maintain connections to this ancient tradition, or whether the Banshee will finally fade into merely literary and entertainment contexts, remains an open question that will be answered by the choices made by contemporary Irish communities around the world. In the winter of 2023, Siobhan McCarthy received an unexpected phone call at her home in Boston. The voice on the other end was her cousin Padraig, calling from County Cork, with news that would change both their lives forever. Their grandfather, Seamus McCarthy, the last keeper of their family's oral traditions, was dying, and he had one final story to tell. The story of how their family's Banshee had appeared to him 50 years earlier, keening for the death of Siobhan's grandmother in childbirth, and how she had continued to watch over the McCarthy line through 5 decades of emigration, assimilation, and cultural change. As Siobhan boarded a plane for Ireland, carrying with her a digital recorder to capture her grandfather's final words, she embodied something that would have seemed impossible to previous generations. A thoroughly modern woman, educated at Harvard Business School, fluent in technology and global finance, yet still connected to supernatural traditions that predated Christianity in Ireland. Her journey represents the complex reality of Banshee belief in the 21st century, where ancient traditions and contemporary life coexist in ways that defy simple categorization. The story of the Banshee that we have, traced through these pages, is ultimately a story about the persistence of mystery in human experience. Despite centuries of scientific advancement, technological innovation, and cultural change, there remains something in the human psyche that craves connection to forces beyond the material world. The Banshee has survived not because people are ignorant or superstitious, but because she serves needs that no amount of progress can eliminate. The need to feel connected to family and heritage, the need to find meaning in loss and death, and the need to believe that human existence encompasses realities beyond what can be measured and quantified. From her origins as a Celtic war goddess crying over ancient battlefields to her contemporary manifestations in hospital corridors and video calls, the Banshee has proven remarkably adaptable while maintaining her essential nature. She remains what she has always been: a herald of death, a guardian of family, and a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Yet each generation has reimagined her to fit its own needs and circumstances, ensuring her continued relevance across more than a millennium of cultural change. The democratization of Banshee belief that we have witnessed represents one of the most significant developments in her long evolution. Where once she served only the ancient nobility of Ireland, she now extends her protection to anyone who maintains a connection to Irish heritage. This expansion reflects broader changes in how cultural identity is constructed and maintained in the modern world, where ancestry matters less than conscious choice to embrace and preserve traditional ways of knowing. The global spread of Banshee belief through the Irish diaspora has transformed her from a local supernatural phenomenon into a worldwide cultural symbol. Irish communities in Boston and Sydney, in London and Buenos Aires, continue to report Banshee encounters that maintain surprising consistency with traditional Irish accounts, while adapting to local conditions and contemporary circumstances. This global presence suggests that the Banshee has tapped into something universal in human experience, transcending her specifically Irish origins to speak to broader human needs and fears. The tension between authenticity and adaptation that characterizes contemporary Banshee tradition reflects broader challenges facing all cultural traditions in an interconnected world. How much can a tradition change while remaining authentic? How can ancient beliefs remain relevant without losing their essential meaning? How can communities preserve their distinctive cultural heritage while participating in global cultural exchange? The Banshee's continued evolution offers one model for how traditional knowledge can survive and thrive in contemporary contexts. The commercial and popular culture appropriation of Banshee imagery presents both opportunities and challenges for authentic tradition. While Hollywood movies and horror novels may introduce the Banshee to new audiences who develop genuine interest in Irish culture, they also risk reducing rich cultural traditions to simplistic entertainment products. The challenge for cultural preservationists is distinguishing between appreciation and appropriation, between respectful adaptation and exploitative commercialization. The role of technology in preserving and transmitting Banshee tradition represents another significant development. Digital platforms have created new opportunities for sharing supernatural experiences, maintaining cultural connections across vast distances, and preserving traditional knowledge that might otherwise be lost. Yet technology also facilitates the decontextualization of traditional beliefs, allowing them to be separated from their cultural origins and recombined in ways that may distort their original meanings. The academic study of Banshee tradition has evolved from dismissive debunking to serious cultural analysis, reflecting broader changes in how scholars approach traditional knowledge systems. Contemporary researchers recognize that supernatural beliefs serve important psychological, social, and cultural functions, regardless of their objective truth claims. This scholarly legitimation has helped ensure that Banshee traditions are preserved and studied, contributing to their continued vitality. The medical and therapeutic community's growing recognition of the psychological importance of supernatural beliefs represents another positive development for Banshee tradition. Healthcare professionals increasingly understand that spiritual and cultural factors play important roles in how people process illness, death, and loss. This recognition creates space for Banshee beliefs to coexist with scientific medicine, serving complementary rather than competing functions. The revival of interest in Celtic spirituality and indigenous knowledge systems has created new contexts for Banshee tradition while raising complex questions about cultural authenticity. Neo-pagan movements and New Age practices often incorporate Banshee imagery and concepts, but in ways that may have little connection to authentic Irish tradition. These appropriations highlight the ongoing challenge of maintaining cultural specificity in an era of spiritual eclecticism. Looking toward the future, several factors will likely influence the continued evolution of Banshee tradition. Climate change and environmental degradation may increase interest in traditional knowledge systems that emphasize connection to land and place. Political instability and social fragmentation may drive people to seek cultural identities and community connections that transcend immediate circumstances. Advances in neuroscience and consciousness research may provide new frameworks for understanding supernatural experiences without dismissing their cultural significance. The next generation of Irish people, both in Ireland and throughout the diaspora, will face choices about which aspects of their cultural heritage to preserve and which to allow to fade. The Banshee's survival will depend on whether young people find her relevant to their lives and meaningful for their identities. Early indications suggest that supernatural traditions maintain surprising appeal even for generations raised in secular, technological societies, but this appeal may require continued adaptation and reinterpretation. The Banshee's story ultimately reveals the remarkable resilience of human cultural creativity. She has survived the fall of Celtic civilization, the arrival of Christianity, the conquest of Ireland, the trauma of famine and emigration, the challenges of modernization, and the pressures of globalization. Each challenge has prompted new adaptations that have kept her relevant and meaningful for new generations and new circumstances. Perhaps most importantly, the Banshee's persistence demonstrates that human beings require more than material security and scientific explanation to live fulfilling lives. We need stories that connect us to something larger than ourselves, traditions that link us to our ancestors and descendants, and mysteries that remind us that existence encompasses realities beyond our complete understanding. The Banshee provides all of these things, wrapped in a cultural tradition that has proven remarkably durable and adaptable. As Siobhan McCarthy sat beside her grandfather's bed in Cork, listening to him describe the Banshee's appearance 50 years earlier, she was participating in a chain of cultural transmission that stretched back over 1,000 years. the technology that had brought her from Boston to Cork in a matter of hours, the digital recorder that preserved her grandfather's words for future generations, and the global Irish community that would eventually hear his story all represented innovations that previous generations could never have imagined. Yet the essential human experiences that the story addressed, love, loss, family connection, and the search for meaning in the face of mortality, remained unchanged. The Banshee's cry echoes across centuries and continents, adapting to new voices and new contexts while maintaining its essential message that death is not the end of connection, that family bonds transcend mortality, and that some realities exist beyond the reach of material explanation. Whether she appears as a Celtic war goddess, a medieval clan guardian, an immigrant folk belief, a Hollywood horror character, or a contemporary spiritual presence, she continues to serve the same fundamental function, reminding us that we are part of something larger than ourselves, something that death cannot destroy and change cannot diminish. In a world increasingly dominated by technological innovation and scientific materialism, the Banshee's survival offers hope that human culture retains the capacity for mystery, meaning, and connection to forces beyond immediate comprehension. Her voice joins the eternal conversation between past and present, between the living and the dead, between the known and the unknowable. As long as human beings seek to understand their place in the cosmos and their connections to each other, the Banshee's keen will continue to echo through the mists of time, carrying messages from the other world to any who have ears to hear. The voice that began as the cry of Celtic goddesses over ancient battlefields has become the whispered wisdom of grandmothers to grandchildren, the shared story of immigrant communities, and the cultural bridge connecting Irish people around the world to their common heritage. It is a voice that speaks of loss and love, of tradition and change, of the persistence of the sacred in an increasingly secular world. The Banshee's tale is far from over. As new generations of Irish people face new challenges and opportunities, they will undoubtedly find new ways to interpret and adapt her story to their own needs and circumstances. But the essential truth she represents, that human experience encompasses mysteries beyond material explanation and connections that transcend mortal limitations, will continue to resonate as long as human beings seek meaning in their lives and comfort in their losses. The keen continues, eternal and ever-changing, a voice from the other world that speaks to the deepest needs of the human heart. In her cry, we hear not just the herald of death, but the affirmation of life. Not just the end of individual existence, but the continuation of family and culture. Not just the final silence, but the eternal conversation between all who have lived and all who are yet to be born. The Banshee endures because we need her to endure, and she will continue as long as that need exists, which is to say, as long as human beings walk the earth, seeking connection, meaning, and hope in the face of mortality's inevitability. Her voice joins the chorus of all human culture, adding its distinctive note to the symphony of stories, beliefs, and traditions that make existence bearable and life meaningful. The Wailing Woman of Ireland has become the guardian spirit of human hope itself, proof that some things transcend death, time, and change. In her eternal keen, we hear the voice of culture itself, persistent, adaptable, and forever reaching across the void between what we know and what we need to believe, between what we can prove and what we cannot bear to lose.